Well, good morning. I have a question for you. Are you religious? You might think, well, that's a dumb question. I'm sitting in a church. But I wonder if you've ever been asked that question before, perhaps by a friend or a coworker or a boss. And maybe you're here with us for whatever reason and you're not religious. Perhaps that's a question you've asked someone before. But I wonder, when you hear that question, what kind of answers do we typically get? Or what kind of answers do we typically give when someone asks us that question? You know, I think of things that I've heard before, and I think typically when that question's asked, we hear things like, yeah, sure, I'm religious, you know. Again, I try to go to church regularly. I try to read the Bible. I try to give money to my church. I try to pray, right? In other words, when that question's usually asked, you know, the answers that we tend to hear, or the answers that maybe even we tend to give, are really just kind of a list of do's and don'ts, right? And of course, that's because I think for the average person, being religious is about those sort of do's and don'ts. And you can see this even in this sort of increasingly common sentiment among millennials, my generation. You know, when they're asked that question, oftentimes what you'll hear is, well, I'm not religious, but I'm what? Spiritual. Yeah. I don't go to church, or I don't read the Bible. I don't do any specific religious practices, but I try to do my best. Try to be true to myself. Try to be a good person. I try to help others. I try not to hurt others when they treat me wrong. And I believe there's some kind of positive force out there helping me become the best version of myself. But if you notice, even in that response, we still have what? A list of do's and don'ts. The difference between being religious or being spiritual, I don't think is much in that case. It's sort of the difference between formality and a lack of formality, right? When we say we're religious, what we really mean is, well, I do some things that are kind of more formal or stuffy. But if we're spiritual, we sort of just do more vague things that just sort of seem spiritual to us. Either way, whether it's religion or spirituality, oftentimes these things just boil down to a list of rules to live by to help us become better versions of ourselves. But is that what religion or even spirituality is truly about? Perhaps more importantly, is that what the religion of the Bible is even about? I mean, is Christianity like any other spiritual or religious system, like Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam or Scientology, right? Is it just another alternative list of rules to live by to help us become better versions of ourselves? Is that what God cares most about? That we do the right things to become better versions of ourselves, that we follow all the rules. So when you think about that question, are you religious? Even if you're a Christian, I wonder, do you simply think of whether or not you're doing or not doing the right things? Is that what God is concerned about? Or is God concerned about something far more fundamental? Well, I think as we consider our text this morning, we'll see that being truly religious in God's eyes goes much deeper than a list of do's and don'ts. Because as Jesus is going to help us see, you can do all the right things for all the wrong reasons and have a religion that is fundamentally worthless. So if you have a Bible with you, please turn with me to Matthew chapter 6. This morning, we're going to be returning to our series in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, which contains some of the most famous and well-known teachings of Jesus. Many people, even those who aren't Christians, are familiar with the teachings found in the Sermon on the Mount. We've all heard bits and pieces of the Sermon on the Mount quoted by politicians, philosophers, even just random people in our own jobs and culture. I mean, everybody seems to know something about the Sermon on the Mount. But while many are willing to sort of pay their respects to the teachings found here, few seem to truly understand the weight and the significance of Jesus' words here. And it's not an exaggeration, I think, for us to say that the Sermon on the Mount contains some of the most misunderstood and misapplied teachings in the entire Bible. And as we've been working our way through chapter 5, we saw just how challenging and demanding Jesus' words are here. You know, our culture likes to think of the Sermon on the Mount as this sort of highfalutin, nice piece of wisdom. Yeah, sure, Jesus is a good teacher, Sermon on the Mount. But if you'll remember, as we worked our way through chapter 5, Jesus' words were anything if not deeply, deeply provoking. And that's because, as we've seen, this teaching is really intended by Jesus to provide us a picture of the superior character of his kingdom and the superior character of the citizens of that kingdom. That's an important thing to notice, because as we continue to unpack the Sermon on the Mount, we want to be sure to keep in mind that the qualities and the characteristics that Jesus is bringing out throughout this sermon, they're not to be read as a rules of simple do's and don'ts for entering the kingdom, but as qualities and deep characteristics that should mark those who are already a part of the kingdom. In other words, when we approach the Sermon on the Mount, and we've said this before, but it's worth noting time and again, we want to be careful to make sure that we understand that Jesus is painting a picture for us here, not of what it looks like to become religious or to become a Christian, but what it looks like to truly live out the Christian life that we have been brought into. And as we've already seen, that's a crucial distinction if we're to make sense out of and apply these words rightly. But it's also important for us to remember again that Jesus highlights this superior character of his kingdom by contrasting it over and over and over again with the superficial and self-serving religion of this world, as typified in the leading religious teachers of his day, the scribes and the Pharisees. So again, as we work our way through the Sermon on the Mount, we're always keeping those things in mind, that Jesus is demonstrating this superior character of his kingdom and its citizens and exposing the superficial and self-serving religion of this world. And as we came to the end of chapter 5, we saw how Jesus drew these two considerations together through those 6 sort of contrasting statements. And what were those meant to do? They were meant to show just how deficient and corrupt even the very best of mankind was when it came to how we approach God's law. Because apart from God's grace, all of us, when it comes to our own attempts to be righteous, are fundamentally selfish and self-serving. And so in doing that, Jesus has shown us more often than not, like the scribes and Pharisees, our own morality is motivated not by a concern for what is objectively right, but how to serve our own self-interest. And so we come to chapter 6 this morning. I think it's no surprise that we're going to find that this same idea is going to be picked up and carried along. The subject matter is going to shift slightly. We'll see that. But Jesus' words in this section are going to prove to be just as challenging and demanding as he continues to expose the potential for hypocrisy for those who would use religion to serve their own interests rather than God. So if you'll follow along with me as I read Matthew 6, verses 1 through 4. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. As I said, Jesus' words mark a sort of shift or a new section in the Sermon on the Mount. If you'll remember in chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus spoke of a kind of righteousness that exceeds the scribes and Pharisees. But now in 6:1, we see his concern is not just on sort of righteousness in general, but how we practice our righteousness specifically. It's a subtle but an important distinction, Because as we work our way through the section, we're going to see that this phrase serves as a kind of shorthand specifically for religious worship or practices. So throughout this section, Jesus is not just dealing with questions of morality, but specifically questions of religious duty or worship. Jesus is highlighting the true character of his people in contrast to the scribes and Pharisees, just as he was in chapter 5. And yet now, what we're dealing with is the superior, not the superior morality, but the superior religion or worship of his people over and against this world. And we can see this highlighted by the way verses 1 through 18 function. So Jesus begins this section in verse 1 with a kind of principle warning regarding our worship that serves as a kind of thesis statement or really a running main idea for the rest of the 2 through 18. And in those verses, in 2 through 18, Jesus takes this main idea or this principle, and then he applies it to 3 specific examples, each of which reflects specific religious practices or duties. So we see the issue of giving, prayer, and fasting. And as we work our way through this text over the next several weeks, we're going to look at each of these examples. We're going to consider them in light of this first main idea here. And we're going to see how Jesus is bringing up each of these practices and highlighting these contrasts and how we approach these things, whether we're approaching them with genuine worship or hypocritical worship. So in order to see this, we need to understand the basic principle in verse 1. So that's where we'll start this morning. We'll look at that basic principle there in verse 1. We'll get a kind of good feel for what Jesus is driving at there. And then we'll spend the rest of our time considering this first example in verses 2 through 4 of giving to the needy. So if you'll look with me there in verse 1. Here we see, when it comes to religion, right off the bat, Jesus' words raise the bar. Jesus is warning us that true religion is about way more than simply doing the right things. Notice what's at stake. Jesus isn't simply concerned with whether or not we're practicing our righteousness. That's not what's the issue. That's not what's at issue here. Jesus doesn't say, make sure you practice your righteousness, period. No, he assumes the practice of righteousness. And yet, even though that's often where the issue begins for us, Jesus wants to move beyond that and wants to show us that there's a way we can practice our righteousness that is a danger to us. Because we're capable of, again, doing the right things in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. And when that happens, Jesus wants us to see that our religious acts become fundamentally worthless. So there's 3 aspects here that help us see this. Jesus is going to point to the manner in which we perform our religious duties or our worship, the motive behind our worship, and then we're going to see an outcome from that. So first, notice how Jesus warns us about this manner or specific way we can practice our righteousness. Notice what he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people. What does this mean? Well, in a very simple sense, we're going to see this drawn out through the coming examples. Jesus is warning us that there's a way we can do the right thing religiously speaking, and yet because we're doing it in front of other people, or in other words, we're doing it loudly and publicly, then we're missing the mark entirely. Already, Jesus is challenging our assumptions that doing the right thing is simply enough. We know this, don't we? Right? Like, there's all kinds of parallels that we can think about. We know that simply doing the right thing and doing it in the wrong way isn't enough. So if I'm a batter on a baseball team, and I'm up at bat, and I decide that I'm going to swing at the bat like I have an axe, and I'm going to swing overhead. Let's say I even hit the ball. So I did all the right things. I hit the ball, right? But I did it in the totally wrong way. Does it matter? Does it matter that I've done the entire right thing in the wrong way? Of course it does. So there's a way that we can do the right thing in the wrong way, and it becomes disastrous. And that's exactly what Jesus is getting at here. But it's not simply a problem of mechanics. In other words, Jesus isn't saying, just make sure nobody sees you. That's the problem. If somebody sees you, then the whole thing is off. It doesn't work anymore. No, that's not principally the problem here. Jesus is bringing up this issue of the manner in which you do it because he wants to drive to this deeper issue, and that's this issue of motives, right? It can't be the case that Jesus is simply telling us, don't let someone see you practice your righteousness. We know that's the case because what did Jesus say in Matthew 5:16? Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to God who is in heaven. You might think, well, which is it, Jesus? Do I let others see my good works, or do I not practice my righteousness in front of them? But that's where this issue of motive comes in. Notice how he follows that up. Beware of practicing before other people what? In order to be seen. In this case, the reason practicing our righteousness before others is a problem is because it reflects a far more fundamental issue in our motives. When we do these things with the purpose of wanting to be seen by others, Jesus is showing us that we're taking the right thing and we're doing it for the wrong reason. What is that reason? Well, it's ultimately so that others will recognize us and praise us for what we're doing. And when we do the right thing for that reason, it becomes fundamentally worthless because it becomes about not serving God, which is what worship is supposed to be about, and it becomes about serving ourself. It turns the whole thing on its head. It makes it a sort of self-aggrandizing religiosity that distorts the entire purpose of worship, which is why Jesus' ultimate warning here is about the outcome. That's what makes this a warning. Jesus isn't simply saying, beware of doing this. Well, why should we beware of it? He tells us, because you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. That's what makes this something that we are to beware of. There's a kind of way that we can practice our worship or our religious duties that is fundamentally skewed in our motives, that is fundamentally self-serving, that will ensure the outcome is that we have no reward. Jesus wants us to see this, to be aware of it, and to recognize that there is a way that we can do this that will prove utterly worthless. Because to worship God for our sake and not for His is really just to worship ourselves. And if that's the case, how could we possibly think that we'll receive the kind of joy and reward that comes from truly worshiping God? I love the way that one pastor and theologian puts it. He says, we love the praise of men. It feels good. Praise is to the ego what sex is to the body. It doesn't just get any better. As long as we're spiritually dead, the ground of natural love is finally me, not God. If you make much of me, I feel loved because I am the final ground of my own happiness. God is not that place. He should be, but He's not. That is what it means to be unconverted, to be natural. The deepest foundation of my happiness is me. The astonishing thing is that people in that condition, listen, can become religious without being converted. They can join churches, start reading the Bible, and even do religious things with no change in the foundation of their happiness. It is still themselves. They are the ground of their own joy. That's exactly what Jesus is getting at. Because when we replace God with ourselves as the fundamental ground and object of our worship, we lose every single time. That's what Jesus is warning us about here. When we become in the prime position rather than God, we are playing a high-stakes game of idolatry. So now we have a clear sense of what's at stake here, what Jesus is concerned with. But to help us see this in greater detail, Jesus is going to give us those three examples. So we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at this first example of giving and seeing how Jesus takes these three elements of manner and motive and outcome and contrasts the sort of wrong way versus the right way. And if you look there in verse 2, Jesus begins with the wrong way. So read with me. When you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that you may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. So first, Jesus says that we are to be warned not to give in such a way that draws unnecessary attention to ourselves. That's the manner that's being addressed here. That's the picture that's being evoked with this idea of a sounding trumpet in the streets or in the synagogue. This language is probably intentionally symbolic or even hyperbolic. We don't know if people were actually doing that. There's no real example that anybody was actually going around and sounding a trumpet before they gave money to the poor. Clearly, Jesus is intending to critique some certain set of people that his audience would have gone, oh, we know who you're talking about. So there was some kind of behavior that these people were doing that would have been recognized. I think it's probably pretty likely, again, that he's sort of tongue-in-cheek pointing at the scribes and the Pharisees, that they're the ones that people would have understood this to be. They were the ones who were probably known for making a pompous show of their generosity. Either way, though, the people that he has in mind here were people who couldn't give to the needy or help others without, we know this expression, tooting their own horn. It's the exact same idea. We know what this looks like, right? We might not pull out musical instruments when we're generous or when we give to other people, but we all know someone who is kind of like this, or we've all sort of done this on some level before. You know, at some point, we've given or we've helped someone or we've done some good for someone else, and we've really just sort of wanted other people to recognize how generous and how kind we are. We know what it means, right, to hashtag humble brag. Heard that expression? You know, it's something we see literally all the time on the internet. I mean, it's almost like the internet was designed to fill the role of the streets and the synagogues here. You know, we don't go out in the street and blow our trumpets, but we are sure really good at hopping on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and letting everybody know of that sort of charitable cause that means so much to us. Oh, it's so rewarding. Look at what I got to do this week. Isn't this great? And we'll couch it in all those terms. We'll say all those things that just makes it look like, we're just the greatest. And yet, when those likes start coming in, it feels really, really good for everybody to see what we're doing and approve of it and praise us. It's the same idea. And what's sad is that most of the time, we can see this when other people do it. We recognize it. It even makes us a little bit angry. That person's they're online, they're doing this. And yet, what's sad is that oftentimes we're oblivious when we do it. Or maybe we're not oblivious. Maybe we just don't care. Maybe at the end of the day, we think, don't I deserve a little bit of recognition for my hard work and my generosity? Don't I deserve just a little bit of a pat on the back? I mean, I wonder if these kind of sentiments ever describe the way you give or the way that you show generosity to other people. And more importantly, I wonder if that concerns you. I mean, if you read this and your temptation is to think about someone else first, I would just caution you to stop and think about those times that you have given. Think about the way that you've given and the kinds of things you've said or the kinds of ways you felt when you didn't get the recognition that you wanted. So instead of thinking about someone else, stop and think about your own generosity. I mean, if we're honest, all of us has done some level of this when it comes to maybe not giving to the poor, but any kind of help, any kind of generosity that we've shown towards someone else in need. We rationalize it in all kinds of ways, but at the end of the day, all of us have helped in such a way where we have been even just a little bit willing to purposely draw attention to ourselves. But Jesus wants us to see that that is hypocrisy. Why? Because again, it points to a deeply flawed motive. Look what he says there about why the hypocrites make a show of their giving. Because they want to be praised. In other words, Jesus is telling us that such loud generosity and giving isn't born out of a genuine desire to help other people. It's not born out of a desire to serve God, but to be seen and praised. But if that's what's driving our generosity, then no matter how much we give or who it is we're helping, again, we're turning the whole act of charity on its head. Aren't we? When we give like this, for this reason, it ceases to become anything but about us. It's not about the people that we're helping or the God that we're proclaiming that we're serving. Giving in this way and for this reason is done ultimately to serve our own glory, our own honor, and our own self-satisfaction. And the danger here is that we give enough, or even that others praise us enough for what we do for them, that we can become easily deluded to think, well, I deserve this praise. I mean, I'm doing a really good thing here. And all the while, we don't realize that we're missing the point entirely. So friends, heed the warning that Jesus has for you. When it comes to your own generosity, does this describe your own heart? Do you find yourself delighting more in those feelings of self-satisfaction and pride that you get from helping others? Maybe you're a really generous person. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem is that the reason you're such a generous person is because it feels so good. Recognize the danger here. You are potentially all the more at risk. Perhaps more than anyone else, you have cause to examine your own motives. But regardless, all of us need to recognize that on some level this describes us. And Jesus is warning us here that if that's the case, and these are the reasons that we're giving, then those fleeting feelings of self-satisfaction are all that we're really ever going to get. Notice that that's the outcome that he warns us about here. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. What is Jesus saying? In essence, he's saying that if you and I are willing to settle for using generosity as a means of garnering praise for ourselves, then quite tragically, that's all we're ever going to get. Why is that tragic, you might say? That's what I want. Well, think about how fleeting that feeling of satisfaction is when others praise you for your generosity. Think about how quickly it fades. It's never enough, never lasts long enough. They forget, they move on. You try to remind them, hey, remember when I did that thing for you? No, not really. The praise of others may feel good for a moment, but it's never enough, is it? How quickly it fades. It is fleeting, and it is a hollow reward in the end. And it's one that keeps driving us back for more and more and more. One that will never satisfy us in the end. And that's why Jesus warns us here and says that's all we're ever going to get. The praise of others is not only a terrible motive for giving, it is a pathetic reward for giving. And so, friends, again, let me warn you here, don't settle for such a worthless reward. It won't satisfy, it won't last, it won't compare. It won't do us any good in the end. And in fact, it could even damn you. If all we really care about and the only reason that we give is for the sake of our own praise, recognizing that giving is nothing less than idolatry. And God created all of us to worship and obey him. And yet the Bible says that all of us are without excuse because although we know God deserves our worship, we have all failed to honor him and give thanks to him as God. Romans says we have become futile in our thinking and our foolish hearts have been darkened and all of us have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for one form of idolatry or another. At the end of the day, left to ourselves, we would rather worship ourselves than God. And one of the greatest, most tragic things is that we would even take good things like charity and turn them into a form of idolatry. And that's what Jesus is warning us about today. That's what he wants to open our eyes to see. Jesus doesn't simply want our religious performance. He wants our entire heart. And that's the good news of the gospel. Jesus came and lived the perfectly obedient life, God-honoring life that you and I have not lived and even refused to live. And he died the death that we deserve for our rebellion and our idolatry against God. And he did all of that in order to save us from our sin and our idolatry so that he might transform us into a people who genuinely and truly worship our God. The gospel isn't simply about getting us out of hell or into heaven. It's about restoring our fractured and corrupted worship. So if you're with us this morning and you recognize maybe that you've never been changed like this, or that your religion or that your spirituality or that your generosity, it's simply just a vehicle for your own idolatry, let me encourage you, confess that reality. Turn to Jesus as your only hope of forgiveness and change before God. If you will put your trust in Him and not in yourself, God promises that you will be set free from your idolatry so that you may finally love and serve others out of a genuine desire to love God and help them. And that leads us to the final section here this morning, because Jesus doesn't just want us to see how worthless it is to give in the wrong way with the wrong motive. He wants us to see ultimately the infinite value of what it looks like to give in the right way with the right motive. And that's only something we can do if we've experienced this transforming grace. Look with me there, verse 3. Jesus says, "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Here Jesus once again draws our attention to a certain manner of giving, but in this case he does so to draw a clear contrast to the kind of loud and showy giving that we saw in verse 2. Instead of giving like that, Jesus says that we are to give, if we are His followers and have been truly redeemed by Him, we're to give in such a way that our left hand doesn't even know what our right hand is doing. And you might go, okay, what does that mean? Is that even possible? You might be twisting yourself in knots thinking of, okay, how do I sort of give over here and not over here? Does it even work that way? But I think to read it like that is to sort of miss the point again, because this is hyperbolic language. Jesus is using this image to make a point. And the point that He's trying to make is that we should give in such a way that there is a kind of quietness and secrecy to our giving, that we don't even have cause to pay attention to our own acts and to praise even ourselves, right? So there's a world in which we might even say to ourselves, well, I don't tell anybody when I give, but I sure know, and I sure feel really good about it. And Jesus is saying, no, not even that. There should be a kind of way that you give that even you don't have cause to see and praise yourself. Your giving should be the exact opposite of the kind of giving that we saw before. Quiet, secret, selfless, and even self-forgetful. It should be a truly genuine act done in a way that displays utter disregard for yourself and a genuine concern for others and a desire to honor God. I think in some sense an illustration is helpful here. I was sort of thinking through, and there's something about this picture that sort of rings true to my experience in one hand, and it's this idea of sort of muscle memory, right? If you think about, when you're playing a sport or you're playing an instrument and you get better and better and better and better, and you have a genuine love for the game, in some ways your goal is to sort of get yourself out of the way. And that process of practice is that sort of process of losing that sense of awareness of your part in this sort of awkward process that you're trying to learn. You want to reach this state of sort of almost thoughtless, automatic action where you're not even aware of what you're doing. And those who are really good at what they're doing in terms of sports or even music, that's what happens. It becomes natural to them. It's second nature. They don't even think about what they're doing. They just know how to do it. They're certainly not focused on themselves in the moment. They're just in love with the game or in love with the music. And there's a sense in which that's sort of the idea that I think Jesus is laying out for us here. We should aim to find ways to give or even just to give in a frequency that is not only quiet, but that just becomes kind of who we are and a natural part of the way we operate, that we're not even really thinking about. Oh, I guess. That's the kind of giving that Jesus has in mind here. But then again, recognize you won't give like this if your motives haven't been radically transformed. Notice that the motive here actually is secrecy itself. The person who gives in this way, Jesus says, does so that their giving may be done in secret. That's the purpose or the motive behind giving like this. Secrecy isn't just the manner of giving this way, it's even the goal of it. But why would secrecy be the goal of our giving? I mean, why would we want to give in such a way that we make sure that our giving is secret? Well, the implication, I think, is clear. Those who've had their motives transformed by the grace of God will recognize the danger of any potential for pride and a love of praise to rise up, and they will covet the secretness of that giving, because they'll know that giving can easily lead to a love for that praise. And so they'll not only do it in such a way where they're pursuing that secret kind of giving, but they'll actually aim for it. But the only way we'll do that, again, is if our giving is solely motivated by a genuine desire to honor God with our giving. Only a genuine desire to please Him can serve as the proper ground of such a motivation. The only way we'll purposefully pursue this kind of quiet, secret, selfless, and even self-forgetful generosity is if ultimately our aim in all giving is to honor Him and Him alone. So friends, I would ask, what does this look like in your life? What would it look like for you and I to give not only without regards for ourselves, but genuine regard for the good of others and the glory of God? Are we willing to not only give and not be seen and recognized, but even eager to make sure that we're not recognized? Do we go out of our way to avoid that temptation to receive praise for our generosity? Do we go out of our way to give in such a way that we are aiming at making sure that others have ample cause to give thanks and praise, not to us, but to God? Friends, the only kind of giving that matters is giving done in a spirit of genuine worship and reverence for God. But paradoxically, it's only when we give in this way and for this reason that we'll be truly blessed. And we see that as we come to the end of our passage. Jesus wants us to be assured there is a true and lasting reward for those who will give like this. Notice what he says in verse 4. This kind of giving will be rewarded by our Father. What does he mean? What kind of reward does he have in mind here? Well, to be perfectly honest, he doesn't spell it out. I wish he did. It would make my job probably a little bit easier. But as I sort of meditated on this and thought about, the context and everything that Jesus has been saying so far, I do think there's an answer. I do think we have a sense of the nature of the reward that Jesus has in mind here. If you step back and you consider this issue and what's at stake here, remember how I said before that when we replace God with ourselves as the fundamental object of worship, we lose every time. But what exactly do we lose? Well, I think in the most obvious sense, we lose the satisfaction and the pleasure of genuine worship, which is to say that we lose the highest and best reward that we can imagine, namely God Himself. Again, Pastor John Piper, he puts it this way: the inner essence of worship is prizing Christ, cherishing Him, treasuring Him, being satisfied with Him. And Jesus wants us to see that when we distort the worship of God into a worship of self, we lose this kind of cherishing. We lose this kind of prizing. We lose the all-surpassing and incomprehensible joy of worshiping the infinite God who made us. And that's why this is a warning for us, because there's something infinitely valuable to be lost here when we do the right thing for the wrong reason. But there's also something infinitely valuable to be gained when we approach generosity with a true spirit of worship. Because it's only when we give out of a genuine desire to honor God that we will in fact be rewarded, not in and of ourselves or because of our own praise, but because of the joy that it is to worship and behold our God. Another faithful pastor, Sinclair Ferguson, put it this way: a Christian is never aiming for the reward. The Christian is always aiming for the satisfaction in God that will bring about forgetfulness of self and make us realize that the amount of satisfaction that we find in Him is itself the reward. Friends, that's what Jesus wants us to see here. True giving done in the right way for the right reason is rewarding, not because of the praise we receive, but because it leads us to look not to the fleeting and vain pleasures of ourselves, but to the all-satisfying and unfathomable pleasure of our God. And that's really what's at stake for us in this question of giving. It's not simply a matter of do or do not. It's a matter of worship. It's a matter of why we are doing what we're doing. That's the question Jesus is laying out for us this morning. That's the question he is going to continue to press into us over these next few weeks. Which outcome will we have? What is going to be the motivation behind our worship and our giving? What is the motivation behind our religion? If it's your own self-serving praise or purposes, or your own desire to be loved and made much of, then you will have your reward. But if it's a desire to know and enjoy the infinite and all-satisfying God of the universe, how great indeed will be that reward. Friends, we can fool others into praising us. We can fool ourselves, but we can't fool God. He knows our motives. He knows what is truly motivating our worship. So, friends, I wonder, which outcome will you choose? Will you pray with me? God, these are excellent words, but they are hard and challenging words for all of us. Father, we confess that left to ourselves, God, religion is just one other way that all of us seek to serve our own interests. But God, we are grateful not only that you sent your Son, but that he spoke with such wisdom and authority, that he has opened our eyes to see, God, the futility of our vain worship of self. God, would you continue to help us see that this morning? God, I pray if there's any here who maybe are seeing that for the first time, God, that you would encourage them, that your response to them is not a harsh word or, God, even anger, but a welcoming, God, a welcoming into your arms. God, that if any here see, God, just the idolatry and the futility of the time they've spent pursuing their own interests, that God, you would encourage them that there are pleasures forevermore at your right hand. God, would you press this word into our hearts this morning? Would you encourage us? Would you teach us? Would you fill us with a desire to give, not for our own interests, but for your glory and the good of others? Father, we ask these things in your Son's name. Amen.